just to quickly introduce myself, I believe we should all be futurists. I think futures should be taught in primary school, and that's a really growing movement. We can see UNESCO and the UN focusing on futures literacy, and that's really, really exciting. But personally, I work at the crossroads of different industries. I look at macro trends, and so I often don't look at fashion actually, but in the end, what I do is often used in the style industry. And I am the very proud founder of the Trend Atelier community, which some of you are a member of. Let me just 1 second, because I just want to make sure I'm admitting everyone, because I don't have anyone assisting me with hosting this today. So yeah, the Trend Atelier community, for those of you who are on the call who may not know about it, is a community for Foresight professionals. And we also have a lot of designers, and generally our common ground is that we are very future oriented. We're very hungry for new methods, but we're also very hungry for change and having a mission and purpose at a time when a lot of playbooks are being rewritten in the world, and when there are critical changes happening. So, but let's talk about research today. Oops, sorry. Someone is honking a horn. I'm not sure if you heard that. So essentially, I guess in future scenarios, oftentimes these scenarios might be 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, 30 years ahead, but oftentimes we're influenced by our ongoing research. And as forecasters and futurists or strategists, we have so many different titles. We all need very healthy habits in terms of our research and really making it an ongoing practice. There's like so many tools we can use to organize our research, and the session today is not really about that. Obviously, some of us like Excel, some of us like Miro, Feedly. There's so many different tools. There's network research, even within the Trend Atelier community. We have shared knowledge. We sort of, in some ways, pool our research. A lot of members check out spaces to feed their research. There's also obviously primary and secondary research, quantitative research, which is an increasingly big thing in the community of Foresight, and qualitative research as part of sort of social sciences. So this is just like a screenshot. At the top here is an Excel sheet from our How to Research course, like a blank sheet with just a bunch of different categories. But I've sort of moved on, and I tend to use Feedly a lot and Miro, but I also just go, I'm sure much like you all, to events. This is the most recent panel talk I went to with on diversity and the treatment of minorities in fashion. And you can't see her in the back, but Aja Barber was talking, so that was really interesting. And then in the Trend Atelier, there's a methodology, a way of grouping research and trends that I started quite a few years ago. I think I created it about 10 years ago almost. I think next year will be 10 years. And it's called the Trend Ecosystems and Trend Molecules. And depending on the timeline that you're working on, whether it's 1 year or 10 years, that will affect sort of clusters, what I call trend molecules of research. So you can group your research, for example, according to design materials, artisan craft and manufacturing, art and experimental design, etc. And so, and obviously that can change depending on the timeline. So these are just, so this is a macro trend ecosystem which would connect to you searching for innovators within these trend molecules. So the innovators in technology and science, the innovators in emerging forms of expression, etc. And so, but I think where there's a place, there's an area in futures research, and please chime in the chat if that sort of resonates with you. But I think that there's there's an area in research where things kind of fall flat somehow in decoding the future somehow, because increasingly it's this kind of sea of noise. And obviously futures research as fact finding is necessary. We have to do it every day, but in some ways it can get flawed. And I think where it gets flawed is perhaps how we filter it, or the goal of what is the scenario we're trying to create. And I'll amplify on this a bit later, but I think where it's flawed especially, and please tell me if you agree in the chat, is that we always think in terms of existing research and signals, and then we sort of say to ourselves, okay, well, if this is what it is today, then this is what we're going to be looking at in the future. And a really good example of this is the very sort of quite common prediction we saw in the media and even with future trends agencies of a touchless future. This was forecasted during the pandemic, that post-pandemic we would have a touchless world. And I'm not sure, like, please put in the chat, but is that the world that we live in today? I don't think so. Yet these were quite confident predictions. So obviously there's amazing ways that we research, looking at the lens of different disciplines or industries with cross-cultural research, or PESTLE is a very common way of researching sociological, environmental factors, economical, technological. These are very, very relevant, especially when we're looking at cultural shifts and behavioral shifts, and especially when we go farther out in time. The farther out in time we go, the more we need to look outside of our own industry. However, because we use all of these same techniques, we sometimes see homogenization, especially that we often pull from the same pool of data. And so the thing that gets confusing, and we have these conversations very often, is when you do a lot of research, whether it's for your design work or in Foresight or Futures, you realize not all the signals are pointing in the same direction. And I see this quite commonly. I don't know if anyone sees this commonly. I'm seeing, Gemma, you wrote something, how to filter the most credible sources within design. Within my science course, we are taught peer-reviewed papers at the most creditable source. What is the equivalent in design? So yeah, I guess there's different metrics in terms of how you might validate a signal, whether some people might validate a signal because it has a lot of likes, because it's getting a lot of traction online. Some organizations might validate a signal because it's a celebrity. Others might validate a signal because it's a specific media outlet. Say, for example, if you're a liberal, it might be The Guardian or the New York Times, or, like you said, academic papers are often a good source as well. But the thing is that we tend to obsess over the methods of research and also social proof. We, especially in an era of AI, we look at what is getting the most hits online, and we look a lot at analysis. We end up doing a lot of analysis, often around data, and these become data things. And this is something that Timothy Morton, who is a philosopher, talks about, even in climate change, data things, the fact that we've had the data on climate change for decades and we haven't done anything about it. So this data sometimes becomes a bit abstract. It's however, really important to constantly do research, but the other challenge is that we can fall into these types of echo chambers with futures research. And the problem is that with our research, if we are responding to events or conditions that are already existing, that are illustrated by our research work, we're essentially in a reactive place, not necessarily anticipating or even being proactive about the future. And the other issue with that is that increasingly the task of analyzing data and streams of information can be automated. So as a human working in Foresight, if you're relying a lot on your talent in gathering data, you're technically at this stage in time and technology potentially easily replaceable, which is, but I think also, you know, in Foresight and design, we also have this kind of peer pressure of the media, which is that we hear a lot, we're on social media. So, but the thing is that where we have common ground, whether you're a quantitative futurist or qualitative one, what we all have in common often is risk mitigation and being able to identify these key emerging trends and these critical uncertainties or blind spots. And but we have to ask ourselves with our futures research, you know, where does that leave us as humans working in Foresight and futures? But I think there's a lot of magic in between, and there's no like final answer. And that's the whole point of, I guess, this call, is not to be like, this is the answer, but it's more of a willingness to ask the questions. And in that sense, the RSA has a wonderful model around that, which you can look up, which is called the living change kind of framework. And you can look that up. And it's the idea that in times like the ones we have today, we have to be willing and open to embrace change in our process, embrace reiteration and change and experimentation within our processes, which can be quite challenging when we're dealing with businesses or big corporations that somewhat need certainty. But I think we need to be really clear about our mission, or the mission of future scenarios that we're mapping out, and the methods to conjure these future scenarios. And Rhiannon is writing, clients' research boundaries become our research boundary due to budget and time constraints. Yeah, and then it becomes a sort of issue, because our role working, whether it's with clients, with students, with collaborators, I would think of clients as collaborators, is that we should also challenge them to their blind spot. But if we're only, it's almost like you could think of future scenarios and approaching areas that you don't know or uncertainties, like you could approach that within your brief for the client and see how, I guess, how open they are to it. But so there's Foresight, obviously, based on current and emerging signals. And I read the term today. It was used by, her name is Daventos. She created the meta futures map on curious futures, but she talks about signal forecasting, which I think is a great term. And so with that, we have modeling, insights, analytics, data. We also increasingly use sentiment analysis, which is a very popular. But for me, the blind spot in that, and I'm working on a new lecture with Rumi Joseph, who is part of the Trend Atelier community, who's an amazing forecaster, former Future Laboratory, and now working a lot with Apple. And he talks about data zombies, which is interesting, that term, because I do really believe in the power of AI and data and foresight, but where does it become our research just in general? If you think of research of what's existing, in some ways it becomes a little bit like a zombie when that's all you're working from, because it's stuff that's already happened. But we have to ask ourselves, this research is indicative of the current zeitgeist, but for what world are we going to optimize this research for, if that makes sense? And so these are just a few examples, and I'm just going to put them in the chat so that you can consult them. This is what's on the slide. But so Curious Futures is an organization spearheaded by Sarah Daventos, and she worked on this meta trends map. She actually worked with oh God, I forgot his name, Matt Klein, who does a great newsletter. And so this is a really interesting map. You can look it up on Curious Futures, and she's a quantitative futurist. She's the head of trends for L'Oreal. And Discover AI is primarily around research. It uses an AI. And Amy Webb, this is a very recent, it's incredibly recent, a very short 1-minute clip on YouTube where she talks about recent data formulas that are being used in AI. And she was saying that there were 40 different formulas that were all very different. And so even with something as certain as AI and surveys and sort of quantitative data, there are a lot of different frameworks because ultimately they're often human-led. But the clincher, if you watch this video on your own time, and it's very quick, it's one of those like YouTube shorts, she says at the end that she thinks that in the end it will be the AI that decides whether the human input is credible, the way the technology is evolving. So that's a whole other conversation. But also traditionally in the field of design, especially with trends, essentially we've been gathering current trend analysis and sort of placing those as something that is defining the future. And of course, there's a place for that, but the problem is that it further embeds. Yeah, Rhiannon, love this map. It's amazing. It was shared in the community. And yeah, simulation gaming, we're going to talk about this. But so we have this sort of going on in the design industry of these trends that are being reported on as well, and that kind of create sometimes an echo chamber. But where it gets interesting with future scenarios, and something that we're working on a lot within the Trend Atelier community, is this idea of preferable futures. And for this is different because this is an approach to futures in terms of the what if for what things should be, for what the world should be. So when we start to go into a more ethical or preferred futures world, then we're looking more at speculative design, storytelling, design futures, what's also called social dreaming. And this is where our research is still very, very important, but sort of needs to be looked at in a different way. And so this is the very famous kind of cone of future scenarios that Amy Webb had created years ago for the Harvard Business Review. And you can see that the farther out you go, the less and less data and evidence you might have. And so the more you need to go towards vision and systems level evolution, but there's a real tension there. We struggle to pair the both. We struggle, but in the field of futures, increasingly we are understanding and accepting that it's not about a given prediction. And increasingly I'm hearing leading voices in futures that are saying, if a forecaster is telling you this is what's going to happen, don't work with them, which is quite a big thing. So it's more about possible futures. So it's about, I think one of the things that I do personally is I look at my research findings, because every day I'm sort of gathering future research. I identify commonalities, but where it gets very interesting, and I'll talk about this later, is the paradoxes. And then I start to create clusters, and I sort of brainstorm with these ideas. But I also have a personal creative process, which is unique to me, where I write a lot, I contemplate, and I try and sort of put my philosopher hat on in terms of what these findings evoke. But the way many of our organizations are set up and run also run on these assumptions that we make about the futures we're expecting. And so this is where I think our futures research can get us into trouble, because in fact, our existing research determines too much the outcome. And what I'm trying to tell you today is that in fact, we have to do all the research, but also liberate ourselves from it. And the future foresight is transdisciplinary. And as we see in the Trend Atelier community, it's also about community. And we have to have a consideration on how to kind of alter how to approach our research so that it fits within a different, perhaps, framework in terms of approaching far future scenarios and scenario planning. So first of all, Stuart Candy, who's an amazing futurist, who's been in this space for since the early 2000s, he talks about different futures. And so it's this idea that, first of all, we should go from the premise that the future will not be the same as the present. So we also have to think in terms of big differences and not just an amplification of our current research. So imagine your research as just the jumping off point. And then we have to think about the fact that any forecast or any vision of the future is only one part of the future. So we have to think of ways of diversifying our research, whether it's going to the source, whether it's making them more ethical by incorporating multiple voices. But the real clincher is that even within that, we're still just raising the possibilities. Even when we look at this kind of altered future that is very different from the present, and plural visions of the future, so futures plural, we still fall short of empathizing with our research and our findings, and this is where it needs to become something that increasingly I'm finding in my work, that it has to be immersive. The future scenario, it's great if you have a workshop and you use the research to inform perhaps some of the ingredients in your workshop, but it has to find some way of being immersive. And so these are some recent areas of organizing your research that I recently came across, also thanks to the work of Stuart Candy, who was sharing this in one of his videos. So I discovered this causal layered analysis by Sohail Inayatullah, and it's offered as a new futures research method. I'm just going to put the link. I just realized I haven't put all the links here, but so you can look it up on your own time. So she says that, sorry, I'm not sure if it's a she actually, so let me take that back. But the challenge is to conduct research that moves up and down these layers of analysis and thus is inclusive of different ways of knowing. I'm just quoting the piece here, but it's explained that the first level is litany, so quantitative trends, problems, often exaggerated, often used for political purposes. And so Sohail Inayatullah explains that we have to group our research towards these 4 categories and sort of navigate through them. And the second level is more connected with social causes, including economic, cultural, political, and historical factors. And you can also interpret quantitative data. And the third level is more worldviews, so culture, perhaps, for example, lack of women's power, or lack of social security, or what's perhaps happening with marginalized communities. So this is more to find deeper social cultural structures, and the fourth layer is more about myths, really. What's the storytelling in our culture? What are unconscious themes that we have that we play out, and these type of emotional dimensions in culture, whether local or global. And so I highly encourage you because this is very much a pluridimensional way of looking at your research, because within these groups, you could also frame it between what's very emerging and hidden, and what's already mainstream, so visible, but you could also frame it between what's very short term and what's very long term. So this is a really interesting model. And then this is a model we've used in the Trend Atelier community called the syntropic flower model that we created, which is a different way of grouping ideas, I guess, more around the greater good. So imagine this is a future trend report, but alternatively, it could be you group your research, an area by the numbers, an area what's best for people, an area what's best for planet, what's best for prosperity. But and this is, I think, in reference to what you were saying, Sveti, in the chat about using simulation gaming to create future scenarios. So this is a game created by Stuart Candy and Jeff Watson for Situation Lab, and it's called the Future Thing game. And actually, no, the thing from the future. And so you can actually download the game. So it's open source. And in this video, Stuart Candy, you can look it up, Open Sourcing the Future. He explains how to use the game. And so the game has 4 different types of cards. And sorry, it's a bit loud. The game has 4 different types of cards and essentially challenges you. I can see if I can pull it up. But it essentially challenges you to, for example, it might say situation, you're in a bus, then the global scenario, collapse. So you pair that card. And then another scenario, and you have a total of 4. And it's through gaming that then you're able to imagine these future scenarios. And the point is that your research for these future scenarios is, of course, going to influence you, and is going to be critical also in terms of even being critical. So the magic is in between sort of gathering your data, whether it's your desk research or data from an AI tool. For long-term future scenarios, we still need to look at all of that data with imagination, and it's a type of lens to examine your research. So I highly encourage you to perhaps play around with the ways in which you organize your research. So just to go back to this, for example, could this be a different way of organizing your research? So very often we organize our research by industry, for example, or by topic. Could it be that you create new categories? And these categories don't have to be something that's in a methodology. They could be a category that's right for the project or right for you. But it's really ultimately that there is a gulf, really, I think, between our research and then how we sort of represent future forecasts or represent futures, and then what's happening in real life. And what's helpful with long-term scenarios and approaching them from a perspective of experiential futures is that you sort of create a breakthrough where you're immersing yourself in that future scenario. And I think I remember, Gemma, you saying when we did the Care Futures presentations, you wrote to me and you were like, wow, this was so emotive. And so that's why I think, for example, when we look at a project like the Interspecies Banquet that was on display I think in Italy and at the Venice Biennale, but it was also recently on display at Our Time on Earth. This was designed by Superflux. And so if you look closely, this is the idea that species would gather again around a banquet. They also created this video of what the world might look like. And so they created a whole table set of plates that use kintsugi, repair, and different types of cutlery made from found materials. And so they staged this scenario and it was very immersive. And it's this idea of experiencing the future before it happens. But clearly, Superflux, their team, their collaborators, do an incredible amount of research, and but they are able to use that research and propel it into a type of extreme version of the future. And the reason why that's done in terms of future scenarios is to compel change. And so these are other ways. You could obviously read the book Speculative Thinking, Design Fiction, and Social Dreaming, which is this sort of seminal book on future scenarios using speculative design and social dreaming. Here's another card deck called the Tarot Cards of Tech. And then this is something I did several years ago when I first started collaborating with Days Beauty, which is which future tribe will you be part of in the next 100 years? And so in order to map out these futures, I had to use my research, but I then had to enter into an author mode where I was authoring a future, and I was anchoring it into present research, but only as a reference point in order to help the reader sort of identify with this future somehow. So there was that connection. So I highly advise you to reorganize perhaps your research and even throw away some of the traditional methodologies and try and draw the future, whether it's with writing, cards, post-its, conversations with your team. Maybe some of you use digital design, but this is the Arab 2050 scenarios that they published during the pandemic. So this was a drawing right here, as you can see, of the post-Anthropocene. And then this was the scenario in Extinction Express. So these were and I can put these in the chat because they actually made the downloadable report available. So these were 4 divergent futures. And I find that when my research starts really speaking to me, it's actually when I find the friction and the paradoxes in it. And that there's a magic in that space. And so I just want to leave you just with some examples from the Trinity community, but also my own personal work with Care Futures. If you want to check it out, the whole replays on YouTube. This was a piece where we narrated 3 various future scenarios. Colleen Rialon, my research assistant, created a scenario. She's very talented at writing. And I created 2 scenarios, and we narrated them, and all we did was 1 visual. And we even used Canva available sort of visuals. So if you're feeling like you want to translate a world with visuals, it's very easy to do that today. And God knows, with the AI tools being developed now, with DALL-E and other tools for video, you could even use that. We also have a lecture on speculative design in one of our courses, and we've done workshops like Invent Your Own Economy in the community. This was led by Rachel Taylor, who's a specialist. She's an academic, fashion academic, but she's also very much specialized in alternative economies. And then this was a scenario, again, written because my weapon of choice tends to be writing for trying to immerse people into future scenarios. But what I would say is that see the future and therefore your research as layered. And in that research, you need to extract what is unlikely. And how you do that is by introducing gamification, introducing unlikely questions of unlikely futures. And for those of you who might be afraid that some of these questions might feel dystopian for your client, remind them that no, it's hopeful. The most hopeful thing you could do is look at these scenarios, because you have to ask yourself as an organization, are you prepared for this future? If this future is possible, like for example, we just went through a pandemic, are you prepared for this future? And if this future happens, what would you do about it? And you can scenario plan. So one of the things I haven't mentioned here is obviously the practice of backcasting. So one of the things you could do once you've sort of established a future scenario, whether it's through workshopping or using games, you could also then, if you have an established future scenario, and by the way, big projects do this. I've worked with Hackmasters, an organization that commissioned me to come into a project with Dubai 10X about 5 years ago, when they were envisioning the future of Dubai and the future of the airport. And we workshopped around these future scenarios. They took executives from the government and created these scenarios and immersed them in them. Then there was this type of collective choice of a common future scenario. And then from that, if you've created that future scenario, you could literally backcast from it to see what needs to be implemented in order to potentially reach that future. So Rhiannon said, yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that's a great example, Rhiannon, and then that gives me just a perfect segue to stop my slideshow. I'm just going to say quickly, thank you, and join us on the trendatelier.com if you haven't already, and these are IGs, and I'm going to stop sharing now. But to your point, I'm not sure if you'd like to talk a little. You probably can't talk much about it, Rhiannon, but it's a very good example what Rhiannon just shared, that we often think that future scenario thinking is a little bit far-fetched, but actually in my research, it's most commonly used in infrastructure, huge governmental organizations like the UN, UNESCO, et cetera, people who are really looking at long-term projects. So we have, if you want, we can go a little bit over time if you have time. I don't mind, but I'm happy to just chat now about this and see if this resonates with you, if there's anything you learned about this, or anything, or questions unanswered.
I just wanted to say it was really amazing. I think there's a lot both of validation of current stuff I'm using, but also some really interesting new bits and things that maybe I learned when I was studying that I haven't used in a while. So it's a nice little nudge to get out of the everyday and experiment a little bit more. I think it was really interesting in particular, you talking about data zombies and the fact that if we rely too much on data, then we're replaceable as futurists. I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
A scary idea, but a push to be more imaginative.
Yeah, I mean, we have to apply these scenarios to our own work and think of what we thought was unlikely.
Yeah, especially with that property developer. I can't talk too much, but I can talk kind of broadly about the process. We thought that they would be really wanting just data, and we kind of built out our futures heavily based on data and using that as evidence at every touch point. And then when it got to the end and they were like, we actually don't know what to do with it, that's when we built in some more speculative futures, and then we did the backcasting exercise with them. So yeah, it's interesting sometimes what you think a client wants and the journey to get there isn't always the same. So
yeah. Anybody else would like to add to Rhiannon's contribution? I'm just answering in the chat. I think Sveti, sorry to call you out, but you were talking about something you just did as well. Or no, you were talking about Jane McGonigal, who uses simulation gaming. So is that actual video gaming?
Well, I was listening to this podcast, and she has her own method developed for simulation gaming and used it, I think, around 10 years ago with, I think, was UN. And they ended up, I would not say predicting, because I don't like to use the word like predicting the future, but created scenarios and pretty much were very in tune with what happened with the pandemic, with the fires, the pandemic, economic crisis. So, I think that simulation gaming, it's probably really good to take people out of their daily routine or from the now and kind of immerse their mindset to create these future scenarios. But it's also really interesting because I'm increasingly seeing more and more companies relying on sci-fi,
Right.
or bringing sci-fi authors to help them create these scenarios. So I think that's something really interesting as well. Kind of like a new thing bringing into the process. But I love everything what you said, and I love all these methodologies and new ways of thinking. But on a practical level, kind of tying back to what Rhiannon was saying, is that oftentimes we're so compressed by really extreme tight deadline that you can barely do the research, let alone kind of disconnect yourself and having the time to creatively kind of like immerse yourself and create scenarios. Because the deadlines and the time crunch, it's so intense.
Yeah. I think though that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the practice of future scenarios may start being part of what people expect. And perhaps that will be fun for us. Maybe that will be a bit more fun because, and so I'm hoping in that sense that maybe it would become part of the brief. Or I don't know if it's possible for you to make that part of your offer and sort of gauge the reaction.
Yeah. I'm working on a project, and in a couple of weeks, we're going to the company's headquarters to do kind of workshopping and together like doing scenarios. So that's going to be quite interesting, an exciting time. Because when you involve people, your clients, into the process, I think that's super valuable and kind of binds the whole, when they feel they're part of it, they're more vested in it.
Yeah. But I guess I don't know if it's possible, given the time crunch we all have with research, when we're doing our ongoing research, to frame it through the lens of possible scenarios, if that makes sense. So there might be some areas of research that you think, this is more of a fact, like this is what's happening right now, and I just need to know the zeitgeist. But but I think we need to be able to have a way of also framing that horizon scanning that we do, so that when needed, we can pull it into future scenarios.
Yeah.
And that requires potentially us individually, regardless of it's not in a workshop, using the card games for ourselves. I think it needs to be.
I'm really excited about the card games.
Yeah, I love it. Like, just like internalize that process of serendipity and challenging yourself to think of alternative futures rather than like propose it as a type of methodology. It needs to, the principle of experiential futures is that it's something you empathize with. So I think it's something that needs to be lived as well somehow.
And I think that really ties very well to the lecture you did a couple of weeks ago about intuition and some of these steps of how you connect yourself, how you connect with your intuition and create space to go and create these scenarios, to create these processes, when you're so kind of disconnect with the day-to-day life. So I think this is ties very well together. And for those of you who haven't listened to that session, I strongly recommend to revisit it. I think
it's in the
very well with
Atelier
what you talked
community. Some people here are not part of the Atelier community because this was an open call, but I'm just putting the link to the Atelier community, and we do cover intuitive foresight, and I plan on writing more about it. But I just think in terms of data and scenario planning and scenario designing, we have to kind of shift gears and sort of put our storyteller or philosopher hat and kind of curator hat on. And one of the muscles we're going to need to flex more and more is that aspect of looking at the world in a philosophical way, but perhaps also bringing in aspects of personalization, even of your own personal creativity is what I'm saying, and your own personal lens. And I think that's what's going to make our craft still something very special and very valuable. And as such, being able to partner with an AI researcher, with an AI tool that does sentiment analysis could be amazing. I mean, when you look at what Agnieszka Current just did with her artwork Sentimentite, where she used cultural analysis to create her art. I'll just put the link, check it out. It's on Xian, this gallery. So I'll leave you to that, but perhaps a future prop or a future scenario can also be designed with an AI. It's sort of limitless. So I hope this was informative. Just let me know. I sense check the room, because this is the first time I host a surprise open call to everyone, and not just Trend Atelier students and community members. And I've put the Trend Atelier link in the chat. If Rania, I don't think we've met before, or Mathilde, haven't met you before as well, if you want to connect on there. So thank you, everyone. And actually, Abby, food could totally, Abby works at the crossroads of color and food. And so that could be really interesting in terms of also futures design and creating a really immersive experience.
Yeah, my mind is totally thinking a lot of things right now. I think this has been wonderful. And I even just seeing that one presentation of, would you say Superflux?
Yeah.
With the table that they did and everything. I think that was really interesting. So there's a lot of fun, interesting stuff in here. So thank you.
Awesome. Great. So I'll aim to do this again. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful rest of the day. And from wherever you are, I'll say goodbye in my native language. Au revoir. À bientôt.
Ciao. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.